this evening is that we have a Q&A, we have let's say a debate or questions and answers, and afterwards we will also have an opportunity to give the floor to the audience. So I'll start with a question connected with your lecture in the afternoon. At one point you said, and first I'll start with this question, and then of course we will turn to the main topic of tonight's event, and that are of course riots in London and social movements all around Europe. But I'll start with a question which is connected to your lecture in the afternoon. At one point you said the causes of the upcomings in the Arab world exist all over Europe. So first I would ask you, would you agree that the reason for the Arab Spring isn't just the rule of dictators, Mubarak, Ben Ali and so on, but on the one hand also the influence of the West? You mentioned how Hillary Clinton was a good friend with Mubarak, taking her vacation there in Egypt and so on and so on. And on the other hand, the rule of neoliberalism which existed, for example, in Egypt already during Mubarak's time. If you just mention the privatization of textile industry and other industries, we see that already 15 years ago neoliberalism came to the Arab world. So this is the question: would you say that the revolt, and so we will come also to Europe, that the Arab Spring was also caused in a way by the neoliberal model which already existed there in different countries?
Well, I think it varies, but certainly in Tunisia, the cause of the uprising was totally economic. The difference in income, the inequalities in Tunisia were huge. And people who are educated people but have no jobs, but at the same time, all they see on television is wealth. And they see their own elites living in total luxury, living in a bubble world, which is completely luxurious. And people don't like it. Why are we worse than them? Who gave them the right to make so much money just because they are politicians? And that was in Tunisia, which is the least militant or radicalized country historically in the Maghreb, in North Africa, that part of the Arab world. So that is very definitely what triggered it off in Tunisia. In Egypt, it was a combination of the two. Not just under Mubarak, but under Sadat, there'd been a huge reversal in terms of essentially, even under the what the nationalist leaders of the Middle East, some less dictatorial, some more dictatorial, did when they were in power in the 50s and 60s is basically created a safety net for the people. So many people in Egypt went to school, went to university. They had subsidized housing, subsidized free education, subsidized food, and that means a lot to people. It means a lot. And when you remove the social safety net, people react in different ways. One of the things that happens is crime increases. But it's a sort of society began to exist on 2 or 3 levels. And of course in Egypt it was made much worse by the brutality of the regime. A brutality which the West used. When people had to be tortured and renditioned, as they call it. I hate the word rendition, because it tries to mask the reality. It's essentially torture. And in this world where everyone is obsessed with human rights, the people who use human rights as an excuse to invade countries actually also engage in torture. And Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Pakistan, Afghanistan, constantly used to torture prisoners because it's easier to do it there. It's not that they can't do it. in the West, but it's more embarrassing because word leaks out, there's a rule of law, and people can get, punished even. Technically, they deserve to be. So it was a combination of the two that did it in Egypt. But underlying all this is a system of capital which everywhere, but especially in the poorer countries, becomes unacceptable for a majority of the people, and then they have the dual problem. They hate it, but they can't say anything about it, because if they say anything about it, they will be locked up and beaten up. And many Egyptians you talk to, they said, okay, we hate the system, it's shit, but at least let us attack it. That makes us feel a bit better. And they didn't do that. So it was a combination of all these things that produced the uprisings.
In the Guardian, you had written as a reaction to the revolts already in February an article entitled "This is the Arab 1848." It's interesting. Recently, I had a chance to speak with Francis Fukuyama, who had the same thesis, but actually where he is going is a bit different than your thesis, of course. So when I asked him, what do you say about an ad in The Economist where the G8 is trying to invest in the democracy, like we have to build sustainable institutions and so on, he asked, and then I asked him, do you think this will ruin the prospect, the chances for democracy? And then he replied, how do you think this will ruin democracy? So obviously Francis Fukuyama believes the Arab Spring will be an opportunity to get more liberal democracy. And my question for you, of course, is do you think now, when we can see some developments already in the Arab world, but the good news is, of course, Egypt rejected the loan of IMF recently, which I think is very positive. Do you think, anyway, the Arab Spring will give a new opportunity to what Naomi Klein calls a shock doctrine?
Well, we shall see. I'm not 100% sure of that at the moment, but a lot will depend on what newly elected governments in this region, if they are permitted to be elected, will do. If they carry on with the same economic policies as before, but with a democratic shell, then you will have more uprisings. I'm convinced of that, and this time they will be very straightforward uprisings which demand equality and which demand a different socio-economic system. People are not going to tolerate that for too long. So what is likely to happen is you will get newly elected governments, they will have a honeymoon period, but the honeymoon period might be very short because people will expect a lot from them. And if they don't deliver anything in terms of improving the everyday life of ordinary people, people will not care whether they're democratic or dictatorial. They will do something about it, and that is the link with Europe.
So when we come to Europe, you just arrived from London, of course. Some say, and many of us want to believe that that's the truth, that the Tory cuts are a substantial cause for the events in London. And that the riots are a sort of reaction to that. But I had a chance to be in London in March when there were huge anti-cuts protests with more than 200,000 or 300,000 people on the streets, and except some destroyed department stores like Topshop or Vodafone, nothing similar happened to the situation now. And here we come, of course, to the title of again, another article in Guardian, but also the title of this event tonight. Why exactly now, and why in London?
Well, the reasons are very straightforward. It's the uprising of the kids, young people, not just in London, but in 7 or 8 cities in Britain, was a response to what the police did when they surrounded a young black man in a minicab, a taxi, and shot him dead. There was no question about it. The first story they put out, they were fired in self-defense. That story turned out to be completely false, and they had to admit it was false. So, when news spread that this young guy had been killed, there was a wave of anger. And as I wrote that the police, in killing this guy, subconsciously willed the response as well, because they've done it before. It's not the first time that this part of London, North London, is blown up. It's got the largest unemployment level in the city. Inequalities are higher than anywhere else in London. Over 50% of people live under the poverty line. Most are dependent on state handouts. And here you go and kill a young black guy. And then what do you expect? You should have known what would happen, because it's happened before in that very area. And the last time it happened, the young kids got so angry they killed a policeman. And that created a shockwave through British society. Oh, they've killed a policeman. But they have suffered harassment on such a scale that they react like that, not every day, but when these events happen. So that triggered a response, and then people in other parts of the country, seeing what was going on, decided we are angry, we are fed up with the system. We watch every day how bankers and hedge fund operators get huge salaries, get bonus payments. Even the banks, which the government has been forced to bail out, because without the bailouts they would have collapsed. So what's the harm if we kick the windows in a mobile telephone shop and steal all the mobile phones, or steal some sneakers, or steal some clothes, not from very luxurious shops, but from very ordinary shops. So they did it. And this attack on private property angers the bourgeoisie more than anything else. If they just burnt, a few cars or barricades or fort, but this sustained attack on private property and shops, that created an over-response by the British government. And they ordered the magistrates, the government ordered the magistrates to give them tough sentences so that they learn their lesson. But how can they learn the lesson? Why should they learn the lesson? In fact, the more you punish them like that, they will be even worse the next time, saying nothing, the system has nothing to offer us. And we now know from the statistics that the majority of people involved in these riots were between the ages of 18 and 24. And in the last two general elections in Britain, the overwhelming majority of people between the ages of 18 and 24 do not vote anymore, because they feel that voting changes nothing, that whoever you vote for, they are corrupt. They do nothing for ordinary people. And this is in Britain. We're not now talking about an Arab country, we're talking about Britain, where the majority of young people don't vote, like in the United States, with the exception of the Obama campaign, the first Obama campaign. But it's very dire, the situation. You asked whether it was related to the cuts. I don't think so, because the cuts haven't yet had their full impact. But it was related to what has been going on in these conditions of neoliberalism in England for the last 20 years. This is the result of that. Under the last two centre-left governments, social democratic governments, inequalities in income became much, much higher than they had even been under Margaret Thatcher. And they keep going up. So what do people do? And there's no political alternative. They don't create one, and they don't see one. And that is where the heart of the problem. There's no one in England, at any rate, who speaks up for them. And the attacks that have been made on them are quite shocking, actually. Saying very bad language has been used.
Yeah, unlike the indignados in Spain or the people on the Syntagma Square in Greece, the young people in Britain, and that's exactly the problem, didn't have a political message. So a lot of even liberals and leftists said they're not anti-capitalist riots, but capitalist riots, and they even destroyed ordinary shops and so on. What do you say about this argument?
Well, I wouldn't say they are capitalist riots. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Consumerist, okay, let's say.
Yeah, there was an element of that. it's because if people who live in Britain, I mean, the culture of British society since Thatcher has been dominated by two things. It's not just in Britain, but in Britain it reaches a peak of consumerism, celebrity lifestyles, obscene magazines and supplements attached to newspapers which constantly advertise these products, and then your chance to grow rich by appearing on a television show, reality television shows. I mean, it goes very deep. So yes, I think it was both a reflection of the consumerist culture and anger against it simultaneously. It wasn't just one thing or the other, it was both. But they are not, like in Spain, the Indignados were protesting very clearly against the privatization plans, against the center-left government. They didn't allow the trade unions to come into the square in Madrid, the Plaza del Sol. They said, stay out, we want to keep this pure. And in Spain, they did even more than that. That when they used to find out that the police, under the instructions of Zapatero's interior minister, who's a real son of a bitch, were attacking places in Madrid where immigrants lived in order to chuck them out. They used to ring up the Indignados. The Indignados would send 500-600 people, sometimes more, to protect the apartments where immigrants lived. So it was a very well thought out campaign on that level. And in Greece, it was very clear the country was totally in a state of collapse, and the elite of that country, this time PASOK, was not prepared to do anything except follow the instructions of the banks, the European banks, and in particular the German banks. They didn't have any alternative of their own, and that was the protest in Greece. And this is not going to go away. I mean, it will, come back in one form or the other.
We'll come back to Greece, but in one of our conversations, you mentioned that after coming back to Britain after Greece, you will help to start an initiative to articulate the movement, let's say so.
Well, I mean, not me alone, but many people are now talking about doing something which helps to organize discontented layers in British society by offering some political alternative to the parliamentary parties. And the idea I'm thinking about with other people is also linked to British history. That in the 17th century, when you had a revolution in Britain and a civil war, and the king was executed, the first country to do that was Britain. People forget this. Even people in Britain don't remember it, because history as a subject is constantly being downgraded. So the historical memory is very weak all over the world, but in Europe and in countries like Britain and the States as well. So at that time, before their civil war in Britain started, a group of independent members of parliament, rich people, bourgeois people, because no one else was allowed to be in parliament, sent what they called a remonstrance to the king, which a remonstrance was a protest to the king, saying these are our basic demands. And this became known in English history as the Grand Remonstrance. Now, no one knows about it apart from a few people like us who are crazy and still like history. But I said we should organize a grand remonstrance against all the parliamentary parties by the people and try and get 2 million signatures all over the country, and then see if we can organize a march of 1 million people, not just as one single event, but the very process of organizing this in different towns, small and big, will create and bring, we hope, into politics new layers of people who can then be discussed with about whether they are prepared to form part of something which is long-term. and not just short term, but not in the style of traditional parties of the right or the left or the center left, but very open gatherings and assemblies. I'm saying this is at a very primitive stage of discussion. I don't even know whether we will be able to get it off the ground, but that is what we will try and do. Because you see, it's not just alienation from the system, it is also a form of alienation against traditional methods and ways of organizing people. That is also part of the problem, given the history of the left. How political formations, political parties are organized becomes very crucial. So we shall see, but I think initiatives like this need to be taken all over Europe.
Yeah, I'll come back to that and to the future of the left, but in the meantime you mentioned magistrates, of course, and something called quick and night courts, which happened during the Riots in London. So until now, nearly 2,000 people were arrested, and I'll just mention a few radical examples. 22-year-old woman is locked up for 6 months for intention to steal. A couple of young men, 20 years old and 22 years old, are locked up for 4 years for allegedly inciting riots on their Facebook pages. A 17-year-old boy is given community service and he is banned from social media sites just because of a joke on Facebook. 2 in Manchester have been jailed for receiving looted shorts. A young man got 6 months for stealing €3 worth of water, and another young man will probably go to jail for stealing 2 scoops of ice cream. Those are just some radical examples, and my question is, could we also speak about the crisis of the legal system, and do you think these events will turn into a chance for a new rise of the radical right in Britain?
Well, let's start with the magistrates. By the way, I'm in favor of imprisoning people who eat English ice cream. It's awful. It's really bad. That they should stop doing that. But seriously, the way in which the magistrates have been used is utterly shocking. The last time they used them like that was during the Thatcher period, when the government was determined to destroy the miners' trade union and crush the miners, and the miners fought back, and they had these courts sentencing miners to prison just to get them off the streets. And that didn't work. It created a lot of anger and bitterness, but at least the miners were politically active trade unionists. They knew. These young people have no idea why this is being done to them. And here you have another link, that they get obsessed with the social networking sites. Just like the Egyptian despots. If it hadn't been for Facebook, we might have avoided this. Well, it's just nonsense. As if protest is dependent on Facebook. As if there have not been protests before this IT technology swept the world. People do it in different ways. In the very early days of the slave revolts, they used to do it on drum beats, sending messages on drums from one village to the other. The American natives used to do it by signals and by using mirrors and fire. So people find whatever means they can. And this obsession with Facebook, and the government in Britain, like the government in Egypt, saying perhaps BlackBerries should be banned. You know, why are banned BlackBerries? Are they on the take from iPhone? What's the problem? So they overreact, and they are bankrupt because they have no idea what to do, because they will not accept the truth that the reason for this is not something trivial, like BlackBerries and Facebook, that the reason for this alienation has something to do with the way in which the country is going, and has been going now for 25 years. That's the honest truth of it. I mean, when this government comes in and says, in order to go to university, you have to pay a fees which could be up to £9,000 a year. You are making a decision which is exclusively a class decision, which excludes young people from poor backgrounds or even from lower middle class and middle class backgrounds from going to university. You're deliberately trying to restrict the flow of students into universities by making the fees so high that either students get into debt or they can't go. And many kids from poor families say, why bother to go? You know, it's useless. What difference will it make? So the magisterial system is part of this process, and all these young people going into prisons and being kept with hardened criminals, what effect is it going to have on them? A deterrent effect? No. It never works as a deterrent, this sort of treatment. It makes people more angry. So the next time, they'll be even more angry, because they'll still be the same. They won't have jobs, they won't have work, and they'll have been to prison for nothing. Some of the cases created such a scandal that even the media said this is too much, like the woman who was sent to prison for 4 months, leaving her children behind because she had received 2 pieces of underwear stolen from a factory by someone else, and she was punished. So a superior court overruled that verdict and said, freed her immediately because it had become a huge scandal. But you know what it shows is that when it comes to what the government regards as a crisis, the judiciary and the judicial system works as the state wants it to work. Doesn't matter what the traditions are or are not. They do it, and it's justified in the media. This is the way to punish these vandals, these hooligans, and in some cases racist language as well. The interesting thing is, it was not just young black kids. It was a very mixed rebellion. There were lots and lots of white kids in London and in other parts of the cities who joined in. White, poor, working class kids. So it's, in my opinion, it's not only foolish, it's reprehensible. And from the government's point of view, it isn't going to work. So why do it? Because it makes the Prime Minister seem strong. I was on my holiday in my Tuscan villa, and I heard that these kids were rioting, and I rushed back to deal with it. Well, why did you wait 3 days then? Why didn't you just rush back immediately? So it's just politicians trying to garner some support, and it won't even be lasting support, but because sooner or later something else will happen. I'm convinced of that now.
But okay, I have several questions. The first is, do you see any emancipatory potential in new technologies? Facebook, Twitter, and so on? Because we know they were of some use, especially in Egypt.
Yeah, they were of some use. I don't deny that, but it's the point I was making earlier. Let's suppose, look, the majority of Egyptians do not have these. They are not on Facebook. Essentially, the Facebook kids largely came from middle-class families. Everyone has mobile phones, so texting is universal, which is why they tried to stop Vodafone in Egypt, to try and stop the texts from going out. But in terms of the social networking, it is a middle-class thing by and large, and it's spreading a bit, but not as fast as you think. It's interesting because this is the way you mobilize support, which is wonderful. I support it. But all I'm saying is that people who get carried away by this aspect of it forget that protests and mobilizations have been taking place for many centuries. Before these things existed, people used to ring each other up. Before the telephone became universal, people in neighborhoods would go on each other's doors and knock, saying, hi, we're going to this protest, this mobilization, are you coming or not? And in Cairo, many people did that in the neighborhoods. Went and knocked on doors saying, we are going, want to come with us? It's better if more of us go as a collective, it's safer. So obviously, the technology played an interesting and useful role in making it quicker to mobilize people. than it was possible to do so before. But had it not existed, this thing would still have happened. So people who get obsessed by the technological side of it are slightly missing the point. And in the first days, many people in the States said, oh, well, shows the importance because we invented all these things. But good, I'm glad you invented them, but they're being used against you.
Yeah, here we come also to the question of mobilization. So you already mentioned one of the possible futures of these riots, and a way of articulating them would be a million march. But in one of your interviews, I think it was on Democracy Now!, I'm not sure, you were talking about the difference between '68 and the anti-war protests in Great Britain 2003 against the war in Iraq, and you said that these protests were gigantic and much larger than anything what happened during the 60s, but nevertheless they failed. So my question is, why do you think a new million march which would be similar to that wouldn't fail? Or would you also form new sorts of organization, maybe direct democracy, maybe something which is happening on the Syntagma Square, or how do you see it?
Well, all the movements in the squares in Greece and in Spain have come to an end.
Yes.
And this is one of the problems we have to confront, that these movements happen, they arise, but unless something is done to organize them politically, they disappear very quickly. And they'll arise again. But it's like peasant uprisings in the medieval periods of Europe and elsewhere. You have peasant jacqueries, which are very strong. They don't succeed in overthrowing feudal absolutism, but they make everyone nervous. Many people are killed. In those days, they used to be killed, the peasants, and then it disappears. So, in some ways, these urban jacqueries that are taking place in Europe remind me of that. The Iraq demonstrations were a classic example. You had 1.5 million people on the streets in London, 2.5 million people in Rome, 2 million people in Madrid, hundreds of thousands in other cities. France was the worst, very low. And everywhere. In the United States, there were huge demonstrations. In New York, you had 250,000 people. In the Bay Area, you had 500,000 people. In Chicago, in very cold weather, you had the largest demonstration in the history of Illinois, with 75,000, 80,000 people coming out and marching. It was not just a European phenomenon. It was a North American phenomenon as well, including in Canada. But all this happened in a period of time where people felt angered by their politicians. They knew they were lying. They knew the politicians were lying about weapons of mass destruction, and they wanted to show them, we know you're lying and we are not in favor of this war. We don't support it. And they came out, and many of them hoped that they would, just by coming out, stop the war. I know that because I spoke to many people. And they said, we were going to stop the war. You know what to do. I didn't want to say, no, you won't. But I almost said it at the big demonstration in London when I spoke. I said, this government is determined to go to war unless we mobilize like this for the next month. And even then we don't know. It's determined to go to war. So when people felt they couldn't influence the governments, and most people who came out on those marches were not people on the left or actively engaged in politics. For most of them, it was the first time they had demonstrated. And they believed they would be able to stop the war. And they couldn't. And they never came out again. Now, the march we are hoping to is not exactly like that. What we want to do, and it's very, very early stages, is to organize in all the different towns a campaign with demands. A demand, we don't know how many, 6, 10 demands of what needs to be done in Britain. which gives you the embryo of a political program around which you can mobilize and organize. I don't know whether, I'm just saying this is what we're discussing. I'm not saying it's going to work or whether it will even happen, but it's at a very early stage of discussion amongst a few people. And we will see how it goes, but we feel responsible that something has to be done. We can't just keep sitting and writing. One has to do something a bit more than that.
Yeah, we mentioned, I would turn a bit to your history and to history as such in order to get back to the future. We mentioned the anti-war movement, and you were there from the beginnings. After the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, Vietnamese occupied the US embassy there, and they were all killed. As a sort of solidarity action and reaction to this action, in '67, you organized a protest march to the US embassy. What was the goal, and could you describe us short what happened there?
Well, it was the big marches took place after the Tet Spring Offensive in Vietnam. And the Vietnamese guerrillas who carried out the attack on the US embassy, the modern word for them would be a suicide attack, because they knew they would all be killed. But in those days, this word hadn't come into action. It was regarded as an act of enormous heroism by the Vietnamese all over the world. All over the world. In France, during the student uprising, the students named a street after the heroic Vietnamese who carried out that attack. So the importance of that particular attack was that it showed that the United States could not win that war. And it showed it not just to the Vietnamese who knew, it showed it to American citizens. Because the Vietnamese were very internationalist like this. They knew they couldn't be defeated, but they didn't think they could win without the help of an anti-war movement in the United States of America. They said that to us hundreds of times. The European anti-war movement was fine, but they needed an anti-war movement in the United States. And when that movement erupted, one of the finest periods in American 20th century history, it was not just students who marched. Everyone marched because there was conscription, which meant that any family in the country could soon be served with a notice that their son, in those days women weren't in the army, that their son was going to fight in Vietnam. And so people would think, why is this war happening? Every year, General Westmoreland stands in Christmas time and says, we're winning the war, and then the embassy is occupied and they take down the American flag and put up the Vietnamese flag on our embassy in Saigon. So that had a huge psychological and political impact, and the anti-war movement grew and grew and grew. I mean, the key anti-war movement, I stress, was that in the United States. And not just, it was what created a trauma for the Pentagon was when you had soldiers marching, soldiers who had served in Vietnam, marching with their medals, marching without arms, marching without legs, marching outside the Pentagon in tens of thousands, the veterans against the war. I mean, if I was a general in the Pentagon and I saw my own soldiers who'd fought and injured and we decorated them, marching and saying, end the war, I would think very hard, because the anti-war movement spread inside the United States military. And it was the combination of the Vietnamese military political offensives and the US anti-war movement which helped to bring that war to an end. And after that, they abolished conscription. So that whenever the United States, decades later, started going to make war, it was not on the basis of conscription, which after all is more democratic, that, okay, the country is fighting a war, either you resist or everyone is liable to go and fight. They didn't do that with Iraq. In Iraq, the US had a volunteer army, the second largest force was Britain, and the third largest force was mercenaries, called contractors by the media, hired to kill, and promised, lots of money, in some cases promised citizenship, etc. So they've changed the way in which wars are fought. In Britain, our demonstrations were important because Britain was considered a very key country, but they were not decisive. I have to be honest, they were very enjoyable, and we had a lot of rock and roll stars marching with us and singing songs against the war. Jagger, later Lennon, many others came. So that was all fun. And, sometimes it became violent. But the key anti-war movement was in the United States of America. It's very important to understand.
Is it true, you mentioned violence, that during the protest in front of the embassy in London, a member of the Angry Brigade came to you and proposed to put a bomb on the embassy, and you succeeded to convince him not to bomb the embassy?
I can't remember. It may have.
I read it somewhere.
Yeah, it may have happened. I don't know. Lots of crazy people were around at the time. And the last thing we needed was provocations, because we knew there were agents provocateurs all over the place. We knew that. And so we were very careful. And recently they made a documentary, the BBC made a documentary, and they talked to the people who had been told to infiltrate the groups organizing the anti-Vietnam protests, because it's, a long time, it's 40 years ago. So now you can talk about it openly, and they describe what they did inside the movement. So one has always got to be, you have to do two things. One, you have to be very open, no nonsense about secrecy. What you're not prepared to say in public, you shouldn't say. That's always been my own way of operating. So they know what you are, who you are, and they don't have to bug your phone to say, be surprised. They know who you are. Our telephones were bugged. Postal workers later told me that every time before the post was delivered to me, either at home or in our offices, the special branch intelligence, police intelligence came and read all the letters. I said, fine. I said to one postal worker, that's fine, we expect that. It's disgusting, but it's not a surprise. But could you tell them not to put the wrong letters back into our envelopes? Because sometimes they do that. Because they're opening so many letters in a rush that they put someone else's letter in our, and we then have to forward it to those people. So it's, so the terrorist groups were very tiny in Britain. The Angry Brigade didn't amount to very much. The countries in the 60s where European terrorist groups were relatively, they were all weak in terms of just being tiny minorities, were usually ex-fascist countries, like Germany and Italy. And I remember arguing with Ulrika Meinhof very openly in the Republican Club in Berlin in February 1968, and she was saying all this. And I said, it's crazy. It really is a crazy strategy. You can't do it. It doesn't mobilize people. It completely isolates you. And she turned to me and she said, you do not understand one thing. That most of the people who carried out orders, as they called them, the crimes during the years of the Third Reich, are still in positions of power in the police, in the judiciary, in the army. We know them because they are our parents. I said, okay, I believe you, of course I believe you, but what good is killing them going to do? I mean, what good, or people they're acting for? It's not the way you win support. Say that in public. Name them, shame them, say this is what you did and today you're supporting the war in Vietnam. The last point on the Vietnam War, which is worth making today, is that because the world was divided into two camps and you had a strong non-aligned movement, centered in three capitals, Belgrade, Delhi, Cairo, what this meant was that the European governments of that time, including all the NATO countries in Europe, refused to send troops to Vietnam. Britain was under very heavy pressure to send troops to Vietnam. No. The Germans didn't. France under de Gaulle publicly broke from NATO and said we're opposed to the war in Vietnam. You're carrying on committing the mistakes we made when we were there. But all the other European countries, none of them were interested in that. How that has changed today, if you think about it. Now they're desperate to send people to show the United States how loyal we are. We support you completely. You know, when they were going to, I think it was Afghanistan, and the little Georgians government said we are desperate to send troops, even 200 to show how loyal we are, but we don't have the planes to do it. Could you send a plane to pick us up and take us to Afghanistan? And the Americans said we have other priorities, maybe later, and then they took them later. But you know, there are about 20 countries with troops in Afghanistan. That has changed in the world, what I was saying in my lecture today. And it's not that we're talking about countries hostile to the United States. These were all countries during the Vietnam War who supported the United States politically, but not militarily.
I would have just another question about Vietnam. Not many people know, but you have written about it, that you were invited by Jean-Paul Sartre and Bertrand Russell by their independent war crimes tribunal to go to Vietnam. So you spent some time in Vietnam. Could you tell us about this?
Well, the fact was that so many atrocities were being committed on a huge scale, not just the use of chemical weapons like Agent Orange and napalm, and the use of anti-personnel bombs and all that stuff forbidden by the codes of war. That Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, and Jean-Paul Sartre decided that we needed to set up an international war crimes tribunal of public opinion against that war. And there was a very famous Yugoslav historian who was involved in that, Vladimir Dedijev from Montenegro, historian and comrade, who played a wonderful role, by the way, in that particular tribunal. Very sharp and incisive, and Isaac Deutscher, and many, many others, people from all over the world. So we were sent, you know, I was, 21, 22, sent to Vietnam to collect evidence. And to North Vietnam. But you know, collecting evidence was easy on one level because you saw it every day. But on another level, it was heartbreaking. And we couldn't travel during the day because the bombing was so heavy. We had to travel at night without lights, being able to use lights. Everything moved slowly. And one witnessed horrific things, actually. You know, for myself, no one was telling me. We were witnessing them. Each and every day, the effects of bombings on civilian life, civilian morale. What was also very interesting was that because the men were fighting in the south, most of the areas we visited were run, there were villages and districts run exclusively by Vietnamese women. And they were trained to defend themselves if they came under attack. So it was a very, you know, for me, it was probably the most formative experience of my life. Being in that country at that particular time. And when I discussed with the North Vietnamese Prime Minister that maybe we should have international brigades like during the Spanish Civil War to come and help, he said no. I'll tell you why, he said. A, because this is not like the Spanish Civil War. The technology now is so advanced, and we don't want to have friends from abroad coming to die with us, because it will be a distraction to look after. We said, you don't have to look. No, we won't do it. And secondly, he said, politically it would be a problem for us. Because if we announce we want international brigades, we know people will come from many parts of Europe and the rest of the world. But our allies in Moscow and Beijing will be very upset because they will think we're being critical of them for not supporting us a bit more. So they said, please don't do it, it'll be very embarrassing. So we didn't do it. But you know, that was what we felt at that particular time.
So I would like to move to the future again. In one interview you mentioned that one reason that the anti-war movement of 2003 failed was that during the 60s, this was an epoch of wars, of revolutions. You had the Cuban Revolution and so on and so on. But wouldn't you say that today, if you look at the Arab world and uprisings to Greece, Spain, maybe even Britain, and so on, would you agree that today we have a platform and a ground to create some similar movement? Could it be similar to the 60s or?
But you know, if you're totally hard and realistic about the 60s, lots of things happened and they were very important. But we suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. The 60s didn't see any victories apart from Vietnam, which was the victory of the Vietnamese and the brave people in the United States. That was a huge triumph. And we saw a victory in Pakistan, where the students struggled for 3 months against a military dictator, which was hardly reported. But that started in November 68 and ended in March 69 with the fall of the dictatorship. Otherwise, we didn't have victories. In France, bourgeois order was stabilized by de Gaulle. Italy, you had a creeping May, but finally they got a grip on it. And the parties of the left, the main party, the PCI, was not at all sympathetic to the huge students and young workers' movements in Italy at the time. In Czechoslovakia, the desire to create socialism with a human face was crushed by Soviet tanks. So we shouldn't, imagine that the 60s were a period of victories. They were not. There were some victories, but mainly defeats. And one should know that the history of the world in terms of struggle for the last 1,000 years, we have very few victories. And even when we have these victories, they are defeated 70, 100, 150 years later. And of course, it creates a new. Whereas now, we have movements which have arisen. None of them were organized carefully or, politically. They were spontaneous movements, and they have won some victories. But now already the Arab Spring is turned to summer, and the summers are very hot, and you melt if you stand in the sun for too long. And I would be hard put to say that we have yet won a victory in any country till now. The victory was, getting rid of the dictatorships in Egypt and Tunisia, but the dictator is one guy and his family. All the people who collaborated with them, who worked with them, they're still in power. It's like sometimes when you have corruption scandals amongst the European elites, and a government minister, someone can be locked up, and everyone feels happy. Look, we have dealt justice. But all the people who were corrupt with him, participated in all these crimes, go free, and they're the ones who celebrate. Because now many see, we've got rid of him, he's exposed, he can't come back to power again, we will now make the money. We will help our cronies get rich. We will work with big business. That's how the world functions today. I don't want to depress you because, these movements are very important. But we have to be, if we are going to succeed in this period, we have to be very hard-headed and realistic. We haven't to be dewy-eyed about any of it. And we have to be very critical about ourselves too. Very important. We were too self-congratulatory in the 60s because we were so surprised by the things that were going on. And we were convinced we were going to win a big victory in Portugal. That was the country where we hoped socialism would triumph. And even there, which was the country that came closest to it failed.
Yeah, Walter Benjamin had a very interesting thesis that every fascism is a result of a failed revolution. If you look at Europe today, not only the Norwegian massacre with Anders Breivik and so on, but also new walls being built between Greece and Turkey, new controls between the borders between Italy and France and so on, also the quick courts in Britain now. Would you say that Europe is turning into a new fascism?
No, I wouldn't call it fascism. Essentially, what we are witnessing all over Europe is a form of authoritarian capitalism. Strong states. In fact, the rise of European fascism in the 20s and 30s was a response to a victorious revolution, not a failed one. People forget this now when they're discussing fascism. All these movements, Mussolini first, and Hitler second, and the Franco Civil War, what was their obsession? The obsession was the Russian Revolution, which had taken place in 1917 and destroyed the rule of capital in that country and offered hope to millions of people all over the world. People had not yet, it was too early to see that the experiment had gone wrong. That fascism was the last response of a frightened bourgeoisie. And the German bourgeoisie said it very openly. If we have to, the choice is either Bolshevik revolution or these gangsters. Let's go with the gangsters because they're at least on our side. And if you look at the profits of the big German corporations, Krupp's, Thyssen, all of them during the Second World War, they jumped from here in 1933 to here in 1942. These were the industries which kept the German war machine going, and the German war machine revived industry. And everyone was employed again. And people will be shocked, but Churchill, who is now treated as the big sort of anti-fascist leader, Churchill was totally in favor of Mussolini. He said that Mussolini's victory in Italy was a huge triumph against Bolshevism. And he said that we are not strong enough to defeat the wave of Bolshevism in Europe, so it's good there are people like Mussolini who might be a bit rough, but they are doing our work for us. And there's also in Churchill's writings, which surprises people even more, where he says that if Britain had been treated like Germany was defeated, I hope that within Britain we would have found a Hitler to lead us. This is Churchill. So don't have too many illusions of what the liberal bourgeoisie was thinking at the time. So the rise of fascism could not have happened without the support of conservative and liberal sectors of the German ruling elite. Could not have happened. And it happened because they were frightened, because, there was unrest in Germany, as you know full well. So today there is no threat like that, not from anywhere. So they don't need to abandon all the old structures and impose a dictatorship. It's not that they're not capable of doing it, but they don't feel threatened. Who threatens them? The working class has been destroyed in most parts of Europe. Deindustrialization has taken place. You have a financialized capitalist system which is based on speculation and making money and not based on production and productive investments. That is the situation all over Europe now, increasingly with partial exceptions. The Germans haven't gone down that route completely, though they have gone part of the way towards it. But the German banks are now in a very dominant position in most parts of Europe. The Chinese have, and then these banks collapse because of their own mistakes and crimes, and no one says anything to them. And the core of neoliberal policy, which is that the state has no role to play, the market must determine everything. But when their banks begin to collapse, they don't allow the market to determine what needs to be done. Because if they did, most of these banks would crumble and something new would have to be built. Then all the bankers and all the neoliberals go on their knees before the state saying, "Dear state, please help us. We need you." And the state pours in billions and billions of dollars, euros to save these banks, and the banks then carry on behaving in exactly the same way. And the Chinese government, or someone from the Chinese government, described this recently, this whole phenomenon of the European and North American states saving the banks like this. They said, very ironic, they said, perhaps we should describe the system they are creating as socialism with American characteristics, meaning it's socialism for the rich. You know, the bankers and the rich mustn't be allowed to suffer. The rest of the country can go to the dogs. And that is now at the heart of the problem, which people, you know, including serious economists, are trying to deal with. If you look at the New York Times, Krugman and Joe Stiglitz, they're not wild, crazy radicals. They're very decent, honest guys, critical, ultra-critical of Obama, whom they supported, because they said he is incapable and too weak to take the measures that are needed if Wall Street is to be brought into line. And they feel it has to be brought into line. And they missed their chance, by the way. I mean, there will be other chances, but they certainly missed it. And so right-wing populism in the States is increasing, and one of the big attacks of the Tea Party people is, why did you bail out these banks? Why did you spend taxpayers' money on these guys? The Tea Party is confused, but here they tapped into what many, many Americans feel. You have high levels of unemployment, and yet huge amounts of money are given to the rich. And people think this can go on forever. And the use, first you have non-productive investments, money makes money makes money, zombie capitalism. And then you have, which areas can we make money on quickly? And usually it's building big ugly houses all over Europe, which they can sell whoever is stupid enough to buy them, usually the Russian oligarchs. It used to be the Arabs, but the Russians have taken over. They buy all these horrible, big, ugly houses with nothing to recommend them, and they don't buy to live in them, but as investments. Save them, and later we will sell them. So human beings and human needs are completely absent from the system as it functions today.
Yeah, and one of my last questions, so we can give the floor to the audience. In your book, The Obama Syndrome, you showed that Obama is actually a continuation of Bush, just with another color, if I may add, especially in the field of war, but also in the field of neoliberal policy. You showed how already in the presidential campaign that the biggest donors were Microsoft, Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, and so on. And instead of making some radical changes in the healthcare system, education, so Obama didn't make it. So my question is, of course, as you have said, the right populists, and if I'm not wrong, also the new one, Perry, are now criticizing the banks and saying the banks are bad and so on. But wouldn't, and probably Obama won't be elected as the president, but wouldn't the right-wing populism be an even bigger danger than Obama?
No, when they come to power, they will do more or less the same things. You know, they want to come to power. I don't think they will make any big reforms in the system at all. And I think this dichotomy between Republican and Democrat in the United States has reached a level that democracy and the democratic process itself is being hollowed out, because large numbers, millions and millions of Americans don't vote, and they feel that there's no one respecting their interests or what they feel or what they need. And Obama had a chance to do it within the first 6 months of his re-election, because he had a Congress and a Senate in which he had majorities, very rare these days. And if they can't even convince Democrats who are elected in the name of the Democratic Party to vote for the measures which should be pushed through, I don't think they even tried very hard. Because Obama from the beginning said, we want to build a consensus. The president I admire the most is Reagan, and Reagan built a consensus, but Reagan built a consensus in a different time, different world time. So to try and do that today was completely self-destructive. I don't know whether Obama will win again or not. It depends on who the Republicans elect. I mean, Rick Perry is a nutty guy, but he's very sharp and clever on some things, and he hasn't lost a single election yet. He's won everything he stood for. So if he plays his cards right, he might win and put Obama out of his misery. But I don't know whether he will. If Obama is elected again, it will be by, I think, by a small vote, and many of his supporters won't vote for him again. Because already we saw that in the elections to the Congress and the Senate. Many of Obama's supporters stayed at home. And if that happens again, then it will be touch and go. But the real problem is not a problem of personalities. It's a problem that of what the United States is and what its place in the world is. And people who were expecting or hoping that there would be a New Deal type style of government, like during Roosevelt's period, before the Second World War, misunderstood again the question of what time we live in. I mean, Roosevelt went that way, not in his first term, by the way, but he went because you had two things going at the time. America had experienced a horrific depression in 1929. Large numbers of people were on the scrap heap. You had a growing and strong labor movement. American trade unions were strong. In Flint, Michigan, you had car factories occupied by workers to win the right to form trade unions. That was going on at home. And abroad, you had the Soviet Union, which had not been discredited at all. And it was the combination that unless we do something, our population might move more leftwards. And they did it. And they did some good things at that time. But Obama was under no pressure at all. No pressure from his own support base. And so he behaved like Bush did. And Bush said not so long ago when he was asked, what do you think about Obama? He said, I couldn't have done these things better myself. So it's, everyone knows that now. But this is a problem, that if this is all what democracy can offer, is a choice between different candidates, and then it all depends on who you like more. It becomes a question of personal choice. So we have consumerism in politics. Well, let's vote for him, he's black, let's vote for her, she's a woman, let's vote for X, he's better looking than Y. Because politics doesn't appear in it anymore, and they all behave in exactly the same way. That's the real problem, and how this problem will be resolved should be worrying the people who rule the world. I mean, you have the Chinese who are very different. They don't pretend. They built the most dynamic capitalism without even this bit of democracy. So all the people who think that without democracy, capitalism can't function, this was always nonsense. But look at China today. It can function perfectly well. There will be uprisings, I'm convinced of it. There have been peasant activities. There have been factory occupations, but not on a large scale.
And my really last question, because I have to ask this now, also Fukuyama rejected his own idea of the end of history exactly because of China, because he now sees that liberal democracy and capitalism isn't the only way. And you mentioned that the future could be totalitarian capitalism in Europe.
Authoritarian capitalism, it looks like increasingly. If you look at a country like Italy, where a joker like Berlusconi, one of the richest men in the country, owns the main television networks, private television networks, and is also the Prime Minister of Italy for 20 years, and it's not seen as a problem. That happens. And so here, in the case of Italy, you have a link between corporate power and political power like this. That could begin to happen. Murdoch plays a similar role till his recent exposure. Every British leader, whether Conservative or Labour, would go to kiss Murdoch's hands, before they went into the Prime Minister's office when they were newly elected. They had to have Murdoch on side because they had no confidence in what they were doing themselves. they felt they needed a large media empire to support them. Why? This is something relatively new, and it doesn't speak well for the system.
So, thanks a lot, Tariq. First, I would like a big applause for Tariq and then questions. First was the question behind, then second, third, fourth, five.
Can I ask you about your opinion of Hugo Chavez, please? How different is your reading of what goes on in Venezuela from what we get fed in the West about Venezuela? Thank you.
Well, I was so angered by the global media treatment of Chavez that I wrote a book about it. And I think it's a disgrace how he was dealt with and how he was presented in Europe and North America. I mean, this is a guy who was elected. This is a guy whose party, after the election, pushed through a Venezuelan constitution, new constitution for Venezuela, supported by 2/3 of the population in a referendum, and the only constitution in the world today which permits citizens, if they collect a requisite number of signatures, to call for the removal of the president before he has served his term and have a new election. Now, all the oligarchic parties in Venezuela, corrupt to the core. The stories of corruption are huge. That's why Chavez came to power, against this corruption. They oppose the constitution, saying it's an authoritarian constitution. So we used to say to the journalists who supported the oligarchy, show us where it's authoritarian. Just show us. I went to Venezuela about 5-6 times in those first few years and saw all the processes. And once the constitution had been won, the same oligarchic parties who had said it challenged it and tried to remove Chavez constitutionally. And I remember talking to him. He said, we know for a fact that they have forged many signatures. But anyway, if they want an election, they want to remove me, let's have it. So they had the election, and he won 60% of the vote. Then he won another election where Jimmy Carter went from the Carter Foundation as a group of international observers. And Carter said publicly in Caracas, I haven't seen such a fair election in my life. So what to do? But the reason for the hatred of Chavez at that time, it's now calmed down a bit, is because he challenged neoliberalism. That was the first big challenge to global neoliberalism, came from Venezuela. And his program was what in the old days we would call a traditional left social democratic program. He would go on television and he would say, till now, all the oil wealth of our country has been looted by the rich. We are going to use this oil wealth to make sure that every poor family in this country gets a free education, gets a free health service, so that people who have been growing up in the slums and feel totally deprived will have a chance. And on that level, he has delivered, which is why he keeps getting elected again. So the campaign against him was absolutely foolish. And you know, if you read the Financial Times and the Economist and the New York Times on Chavez, it's these just completely horrific and based on pure prejudice largely. And why? Okay, they would then say, because I argued with these guys, he's not a dictator as yet, but he's going to become one. So I said, I know you want him to become one, but he might disappoint you. He won't go in that direction. And I discussed with him. I said, what if we lose? I can't remember, it was something, whether it was the recall campaign. He said, if I lose, I lose. I'll fight again. So what? So and what the process is done. It has many weaknesses, of course. One shouldn't say that not everything's perfect. But what the process did was to empower the powerless in that country. They felt at long last they had a president who spoke for their interests and who came from essentially a poor family. And what shocked me the first time I went to Venezuela was the racism from the oligarchs and oligarchic families, including some intellectuals on the left. You know, one of them told a friend of mine, my mother taught me never trust a Zambo. A Zambo is someone of mixed native Indian, Native American, and black blood. That's the word for it, a Zambo, and that is what Chavez has got, his grandparents on both sides. So it was a horrific campaign against him, and then they had to start taking him seriously when the movement began to spread across the borders. Bolivia, Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru to a certain extent. And the important thing is that however weak Lula was on economic policies, he made one thing very clear to Washington: I will not allow Brazil to be used to destabilize Venezuela or Bolivia. I may not agree with everything, but forget it. So there was a degree of South American unity that had not been seen since the 19th century against the Spanish Empire. And that is why I talk about South America a lot, saying Europe could learn a lot from it. I say to European trade unions, I said poor peasants in Peru and really poverty-stricken people in Bolivia challenged neoliberalization and privatization. And they lost their lives doing it, but you guys went along with it. There's nothing we can do. Of course there were things you could do. You weren't prepared to do them, and now we are suffering in Europe as a result of that. So that's... and then, of course, I don't want to go into this too long, but as you know, the United States and the Spanish tried to organize a coup against Chavez, which was defeated. He was removed from power by a group of generals acting with the United States. And two things happened. People poured out onto the streets. And within the military, the soldiers told their officers, we will not accept this coup. We will decide when he goes by voting. We will not allow a coup d'etat. And so the coup collapsed within 48 hours. That was a huge, huge defeat for them, and that strengthened him. Every time they tried to topple him, his position was strengthened. I mean, he's loved in many parts of the world now.
There was another question.
As this is Green Academy, or it's supposed to be, I just wonder what's your opinion on eco-politics or green politics, or what do you think about Greens offering a new paradigm of post-industrial society? How do you see it? Thank you.
Well, I mean, it's very difficult to talk about green politics in the abstract because Greens themselves differ with each other. I mean, the Green Party in Britain is a party I tend to like, and their program is very good on many things. I'm not a great fan of the German Greens. I think the German Greens have, by and large, in my opinion, been embedded and integrated in the German establishment. I think that the French Greens are divided a bit, but they would like to be integrated in the establishment too. But whether that happens is whether they decide not to put up a candidate against the Socialist Party and work with them. But there'll be a division on that. Their programs, programmatically, essentially the Greens have supported neoliberal policies. I mean, quite openly. There's no big secret about that. Their recent bout of popularity in Germany is on nuclear reactors. After Fukushima and the crisis in Japan. That brought them suddenly, because people remembered, oh God, when the Green Party was formed, they were against nuclear reactors. But when they were in government, they didn't push through anything on nuclear reactors. In fact, some of their ideologues defended them. Now you need a huge crisis in Japan to turn them. So to be frank with you, I don't have much hopes for them. And in terms of post-industrial societies, if calling these societies in which we live in Europe post-industrial isn't a great thing, I mean, post-industrialism, I mean, I'm all in favor of ecological safeguards, etc., but the people you have to convince are not people like me, but capitalism. And the capitalist barons and the corporations who, especially in times of crisis, refuse, saying we compete in a huge world, our rivals in the Far East don't believe this, why should we do it? And in America, the big corporations have been against it anyway. And once they turn down any ecological plan, of course you have to fight them, no question about that. But you can't simply fight them by avoiding the subject of capital and who is actually doing all this. And on these questions you don't hear. And I am in favor of productive investments and productive industry being brought back into European countries. I think a situation where you have coastal tourism and land prices jumping up because people want to buy houses which they sell to the rich is a very short-term gain and a very short-term measure. It doesn't offer people, not just people alive today, but their children and grandchildren and those who come after them, any permanence. It makes life very fragile and people volatile. So I'm not a great believer in, and you know, one reason that they get cheap labor from China to do all this stuff, it's also enabled them to completely weaken and destroy the few countervailing forces there were in society, however weak. Trade unions, working class organizations, and virtually with the fall of communism came the total collapse of social democracy as well. The two are not unrelated. So we are left in the situation in which we are. And some Greens say good things, which we can agree with, but as a collective, they don't necessarily do it. And supporting wars which go on and bombings of countries doesn't exactly help the ecology in those countries.
Could you please again raise your hands so we can see? So who was first? Maybe you, then you, then you, and then in the last row. Not sure. Djevojka u sredini, ja mislim da je bila najmniej.
Speaking of protests, can you hear me? So speaking of protests, I would like to ask you if you could perhaps either draw a parallel or derive a lesson from the protests in Europe that you mentioned and those in one particular European country which was protesting again already last December. I'm talking about a country which is exactly 3 border crossings from here, so very much in Europe, but has been a dictatorship for the past 17 years, already has a determined heir to the throne of the dictator, a country where opposition is made impossible, where civil society is also incapable of existing. Of course, I'm talking about Belarus, but that seems to be one blind spot of Europe, something that is completely under the radar, which is not reported for whatever reasons. Now, John McCain said in March that Lukashenko should take a lesson from Mubarak and should watch carefully what happens there. What do you have to say to that? And basically I'm asking, is there a hope for that country where protests are usually quenched in blood? Thanks.
Well, I agree with you on Belarus. It's a dictatorship, everyone knows that. But which dictatorships are toppled depends not just on the degree of repression, but also on how civil society does it. And here, civil society can't just be NGOs given money by the West. That, in my opinion, often deforms civil society and cuts actually cuts many NGOs off. I'm not saying there are not some good NGOs, there are, but not so many. And NGO activity prevents, in many countries, collective movements from developing. It's not the case that that is civil society, it's a deformed version of it. And it's a version which seems good because it creates an illusion. So in terms of Belarus, I think what is absolutely crucial is for people, I know they resist from time to time, I know, and I follow it, but outside support, the key country there is Russia, as you know. Putin is now talking about because Russia is not allowed into the European Union. Putin is talking about creating a Euro-Asian Union and drawing 60% of the former Soviet Union countries, the former Soviet Union, into this union. And if he does so, then, funnily enough, I think there will be, collective pressure can be put on this particular case in Belarus, if that happens. But the key country there is that the United States can't do anything in that region without the approval of Putin. They could defy him, but that would mean opening up a very bad situation with the Russians, which certainly the Germans don't want to do, because they see themselves economically as quite complementary in some ways. A complementarity exists between Germany and Russia. So it's not an easy question to answer, what to do with that case. It's not, you cannot, the situation in Iraq has been a disaster. People who talk about doing in Iraq there, over 1 million Iraqis have died. 5 million orphans in that country. The entire social infrastructure destroyed. So that's hardly a good model for any country. And European citizens, by and large, don't even think about 1 million dead in Iraq. Doesn't bother them. Or some, obviously minorities do. But for the majority, that's what life is like now.
So there were several more questions, but also the mic person had a question, so if you decide.
Okay, I will give.
I don't know who was first. I think in the first row. Oh. Yeah, no, it's direct democracy.
I'm closer to Mike. So I'm holding mine so I can answer.
Could you please stand up so everyone can see you?
Okay. Very often we link capitalism with democracy, and we think it's kind of, one cannot go without other. And you clearly mentioned already examples when there is a capitalism without democracy, or kind of capitalistic dictatorship. So my question would be, do you think we could have participative democracy without capitalism? Or to be more specific, do you think we could have democracy with socialism?
Well, my own position would be that we would need a much better form of democracy, a truly enhanced democracy with socialism. I think the big tragedy of the last century was that the idea of socialism got tainted with the idea of a dictatorship. That's because of where the revolution first happened. Had the revolution erupted in Germany rather than Russia, and had the Russian Revolution followed, we might have had a completely different model, because the German working class was very different, very huge, institutions, working class institutions, very embedded in democracy. We would probably have had a different system of socialism, but the fact that it was Russia, an incredibly backward country, where an overwhelming majority of the people still lived in the countryside, where there was no political tradition of democracy at all under the previous years of the Tsar, meant that when the revolution became completely isolated, the main question for them became, we have to hang on to power at all costs. Remember what happened to the Jacobites. All these intellectuals who were in the leadership of the Bolshevik Party knew their history. And the fall of Robespierre in France obsessed them. For them, it was like we talk about, or we used to talk about the Russian Revolution in the 60s. They used to talk about what happened to the French Revolution. And so power became a goal. And with, I can't give a lecture on that, but with the results that we know. And the one model that was emerging in Prague in 1968, which actually Tito, to his credit, supported and refused to denounced the Soviet invasion of Prague. It was a nice phrase, socialism with a human face. And I remember at the time in Prague, quite astonishing things happened. Political prisoners took over television stations with the support of television journalists and confronted their jailers. Every night they would confront the people who had put them in prison. Now, you imagine that happening and what it does to raise political consciousness. Just that one event. Then you had the Czech press at the time, was the freest press in Europe, including the Western Europe. Huge debates and discussions on a very high level took place in the Czech media. Really encouraging. And then the Soviet tanks went in, and one thing they feared was if we tolerate this in Czechoslovakia, people in Russia will say, why not at home? And that is what would have happened anyway. So they crushed that, and if you look at the response of the West to the crushing of the Prague Spring, it was very muted. Very, very muted. I remember that well. Of course, some people protested, but there was no big propaganda campaign compared to when the Russians invaded Afghanistan, when there was a boycott of the Olympics, this, that, and the other. Because that Czech model actually was very anti-capitalist. It was not a market model at all. It said we have to end the crazy way in which the state rules and have workers' management, discuss what needs to be done, allow the emergence of small family restaurants and shops. That's not a problem. But basically keep all the utilities, etc. on the state. A very interesting model, which one should look at now. So for me, real democracy, by which I mean economic democracy as well, is only possible with socialism. Capitalism existed for 500 years without democracy in Europe. It grew up in the 14th century and 15th century, came to life in the 17th and 18th centuries. You didn't have franchise, it wasn't one person, one vote. The time when the Europeans, all Europeans, citizens got the right to vote in Western Europe was after the First World War. That's when women were allowed to vote. Before that, it was a male vote. So half the population is not allowed to vote. So this notion that somehow Europe was always democratic is nonsense, and people had to fight for their rights. Women waged a huge struggle to fight for their rights, to get the right to vote. Without struggle, you don't get anything. That's the lesson, even of history for reforms.
So it's almost 11, but and I would ask you if you could pose your questions one after another, and then also you maybe in the end, or if anyone else also had a wish to pose a question, but all, one after another, so you answer in the end.
Yeah, and so I can also eat.
Okay, I'm still struggling with what you were saying about London and destruction of neighborhood stores around Hackney being a political protest. I'm still trying to understand that properly, but I want to move my question to Israel and the protest that recently started there with the high rent prices. We haven't been really talking about Israel, but I would just like a short comment. Do you think that the Arab Spring might be spreading also to Israel? Thank you.
I think the Arab Spring, which the Israeli leadership hated, they wanted Mubarak to stay in power, had an impact on Israeli citizens, because they had been told through their media for a long time that the Arabs are useless, they're not interested in democracy, they don't fight, they were just useless people, second-rate people, Untermensch, etc., etc. So then the Arab Spring erupted, and young Israelis obviously watched all this. They're not taught to think themselves as part of that world, but they live there. And clearly it had some effect on them. And the movements in Europe. I think the combination is what created these big, huge assemblies in Tel Aviv. And, you know, I normally hate any conspiracy theories, but Uri Avaneri, the Israeli peace leader, he has said that he wonders whether these clashes have been confected by Netanyahu to try and demobilize the social protesters at home and say, look, our country is under danger again. Who knows? But many Israelis think that the Israelis government has provoked all that. But I think it's a really positive development. And I was asked to send a message of support, which I did. I mean, it's extremely good if this happens, because it just takes many other debates also become possible, which have not so far been possible within Israel.
Please.
I would like to ask you to comment on the WikiLeaks phenomenon, and especially on its, basically on the lack of big popular response to such an openly for the first time publicly disseminated information on the US government precisely and much more other systems from the Western Europe?
I didn't get the last part of the question.
Okay.
If you can repeat.
If you would comment on the WikiLeaks phenomenon and the...
Okay, I get it. The WikiLeaks phenomenon is an old phenomenon. That whenever you have countries engaged in wars, and people within in the case of the Vietnam, the Pentagon Papers, which were leaked during the Vietnam War to expose the lies that were being told, were leaked by a very high official in the State Department, who was sent to prison, but he did it. And I am not one of those, contrary to what sometimes people may think, who thinks that everything in America is wrong. I'm very critical of the American government. But within the United States, there is a tradition, a dissenting tradition. And there are many, many Americans who hate what their government is doing. And when they react angrily. And if they're in positions of power, they leak stuff to embarrass their own government. That is the America one can learn things from. Now, we don't technically know who leaked the WikiLeaks document. I don't want to say it because a young soldier who served in Iraq is locked up in prison without a trial for many, many months now. First kept in very bad conditions in the United States and then allowed slightly better conditions. They have no proof. If he leaked them, he was a very courageous guy, is what I say. And if you read the WikiLeaks stuff, it's not that any of it is that sensational. If you know the part of the world they're talking about, but it actually confirms many things that people like myself have been saying for a long time. But it also shows, ironically enough, that quite a few things we are saying in public are being said to their governments by ambassadors, countries like Britain, the United States, Germany. Privately, they're sending quite harsh reports on the situation, for instance, in Afghanistan, because they know what's going on. Privately, they say that these people are corrupt, they're impossible to work with. The reports on Pakistan, there are one or two dispatches from the American ambassador which amazed me. It shows she's really sharp. She knew it publicly, she would never say that. So what the WikiLeaks phenomena is, it has made public what is being said in private, which means that this idea of the European elites and the American elites to treat their citizens as if they were children has been disrupted through WikiLeaks. You know the old stories when grown-ups talk, not in front of the children. WikiLeaks has shown you can say it in front of the citizens, and it has an impact on them. So it's a positive result.
But there were not one question, but three. If they can be very short, one after another, and then you answer on all of them. And that would be the last one. So you Vedran, if I'm right, or Marco, but really short, please.
Okay, I'll be really quick. I have a lot of questions.
Speak into the mic.
Okay, is this better?
Yes.
I'm just looking at that cover. It's a very disturbing one, so I have to pose a question related to the US. What I'm thinking about is, do you think things would have effectively been different if it had been Hillary Clinton and not Obama? Or equally bad or better? Or I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Should we just take the other questions also? Yeah, maybe. So that's a chance to make the end.
From today to the beginning of the last century, you mentioned 1917, and we're infinitely excited about or fascinated with the October Revolution, but I find the years afterwards much more interesting. In relating to this march of yours, what would the new economic policy of your march look like? If there's an embryonic state, feeling of this new economic policy, similar to what the Bolsheviks had to think about right after they took power. So what would your NEP look like today?
Okay, and the last question.
Back to London. I was wondering, can you comment on the fact that it was widely reported that people used blackberries to coordinate riots, and blackberries, as far as I know, are not something that lower classes use, but it's more of a middle class thing. Plus, in Tottenham, where it all erupted, I mean, unemployment is higher than in the rest of London, but unemployment rate there is 8.8%, which is, I mean, for anyone coming from the region, it's really a low unemployment rate, actually. So, could you comment on the fact, do you really think that it's really a revolt or a riot based on, class or, underprivileged position, or is it something else?
So, thanks a lot for the questions. Did you understand the last one? Is it really a class revolt? From the lower parts, poverty revolt and so on, because on the other hand you have blackberries, you have low unemployment and so on. But maybe the first question on Obama then...
Yeah, the answer on Obama is very brief, actually. I think if McCain had been elected, that's the question you asked. What would
Hillary Clinton.
Hillary.
Completely the same. Without any question. She was even much harder than Obama on wars during the election campaign. And one of the films Hillary put out about Obama in the primaries was very bad, actually, saying that you couldn't trust this guy to take the call at 2 a.m. in the morning and make the decision. Why? I mean, he's an imperial president, and meaning I'm the tough one who will do it. No, I don't think there would have been any difference at all if Hillary had become president. And sooner or later, a woman will become president of the United States and will do what has to be done, what the system needs to be done. So color, gender, for me, don't matter. It's what politicians actually do that matters. It breaks a taboo, as I say in the book. Okay, a man of color has been elected president of the United States, and in that country this is very important and symbolic, because the White House was built by slaves, and now you have his wife comes from a slave family living in it. But okay, symbolism very important, but 2 days later it's business as usual. And if you had a woman elected, whether Hillary now probably won't be, or someone else, maybe a Republican woman, then you have to judge them on the basis of their politics and what they do, and not on the basis of gender or race or class or anything like that. That can't be the exclusive criteria for judging people. What was the second one?
The second was, what would be, if I'm right, the economic policy of your march in London?
Well, I think don't make this into an event. It hasn't happened. We are still discussing it. I'm only taking you into confidence, because it's nice to discuss these things openly. We haven't even agreed on the set of demands, but essentially there will be demands demanding that the public utilities, things which everyone needs, are taken back into state ownership, like gas, electricity, water, that the state should own the utilities which are necessary for all the people, regardless of who they are, and that we should have a deep privatization process taking place, and obviously that there should be a state system of education which is free, and that sections of the population, so it's none of them will be very surprising demands on that level, but they're demands that everyone thinks about and feels. I mean, whether we will put in, I'm in favor of putting in that a democratic Britain should withdraw from NATO, that we end the militarism that has gripped Europe since the collapse of the Cold War. The third question on 1917 and 1918.
No, actually it was the same, but did he answer your question, or could we? Yes, thanks.
Which question was that?
It was about the new economic policy. I'm completely happy with your answer, thanks.
It was together with the answer he made a parallel with the 1970.
The new economic policy, that came in 1920, yes. 20 or 21. Yeah, it was a good policy, by the way, and it revived the economy. You know, that's important, and they could have taken it further if they had thought about it some more, but they were also a country under siege. You realize no one recognized them. There were 22 foreign armies which had intervened to try and crush the revolution, a brutal civil war. After the First World War, so the Russian population was completely exhausted. But yeah, there were good things in the new economic policy.
The last question was about the London riots, so we come back to the beginning, and maybe that's an appropriate way to end it. Most of the rioters, young people, had Blackberries, and that I think it was Tottenham or some other part of London had unemployment of 8%. So is this a contra-argument that those are not riots of poor people and so on?
No, I mean lots of, look, people who are poor and have very little money, it's a tragedy this, but often they spend their money on these things because it's the one way they can establish contact with their friends. I mean, the mobile phone is absolutely vital. I don't know any young people in London who don't have mobile phones, and you have parents arguing with kids of 10 and 11 now, saying, no, you can't have a mobile phone, it'll be snatched from you. A lot of mobile phones are snatched in very well-off suburbs. I mean, in Regent's Park, for instance, there's a group of young kids, unemployed kids, whose only job is to take mobile phones from the rich kids. And there's a friend of mine had a phone taken from him. His son had a phone taken from him. And he said the guy who took it, a guy wearing a hood, suddenly came back and he said, oh, I just switched on your phone. And you have a big friends list, so here's the SIM card, I'll get my own SIM card, take it. So it's not even that all of them are vicious like that, they just can't afford this, but they go for it. That and sneakers, running shoes of all sorts, what to do? This is the world they've grown up in. And for them that's almost more important than getting some food even sometimes, that they go for these things. And they have them. They have them. So it doesn't cut across the argument that these are poor kids. And I told you earlier when I was talking that all the shops of Vodafone, O2 and the mobile companies in Tottenham, on Tottenham High Street, all of them were raided first and the phones left.
So maybe it's a mobile phone riot. I'm kidding. It's almost 2 hours of Tariq answering questions, and this is the opportunity to thank you again for coming to Croatia, for coming to the Green Academy to Vis. Again, a big applause. Tariq is here with us until Friday, so you will have a opportunity.